Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Kalaya Domingo, and I am a staff member with Communities of Opportunity. Before we start our grounding and welcome, I'm actually going to have Roxana join us for her to be able to explain how the interpretation will work today.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you all so much for joining us. We have a very special array of panelists today, and one of our panelists is Spanish speaking. So if you would like to listen to this webinar in English, please click the interpretation button on the bottom of your Zoom screen and select English. Si desea escuchar este seminario en español, haga clic en el botón de interpretación ahí luego en español abajo de su pantalla de Zoom. If you would like to listen to this in English and Spanish, aka Spanglish, you can leave interpretation as is.
Great, thanks so much, Roxana. Next slide. Well, welcome today. I'm really excited for you to join us with our fifth and final series today for our storytelling, grounded in storytelling session. This is the fifth event from our COO speaker series in partnership with La Roxe Productions and BDS Planning. The first session of our speaker series was in Grounded in Belief. Then we moved to Grounded in Place and Space, Grounded in Youth, Grounded in Abundance, and now we are here grounded in storytelling. We are really honored to be here today and to be closing out this series with this amazing panel today. This event is part of the COO learning community, which strives to uplift the narratives, accomplishments, and strategies that are really rooted in the communities that we're working to build community-driven policy systems change so we can create greater equity and justice in King County and beyond. Next slide. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge that many of us, I know that some of us are coming from other places around the country or potentially around the world, but I today am here on the lands of the First People of the Duwamish, Muckleshoot, Puyallup, Snoqualmie, Stillaguamish, Suquamish, and Tulalip tribes. We raise our hands in honor of all the descendants of the Coast Salish people. We thank them for their hospitality as the first people of this land and our continuing use of the natural resources of their ancestral homeland. We honor the immense, immeasurable, and often unrecognized contributions and sacrifices of the Coast Salish people and Indigenous people. And we acknowledge the ongoing disparities, racism, and political invisibility experienced by the Coast Salish and Indigenous people of this land. We are grateful for our partners at the Seattle Urban Native Nonprofits for sharing their land acknowledgement with us. And today I'm also very grateful to be able to center the stories of our panelists, Indigenous storytellers, and cultural workers. I also believe that we should be working towards more justice and really grounding all of our stories and our lived experiences of the people that are most impacted by the inequities that we see. And so I'm grateful to have these stories shared with us today. Next slide. I'm really excited to be able to pass this over now to Roxana, who's really been an amazing partner over the last 2 years. I've actually been so inspired by Roxana's work, not just with us as COO, but the work that she does in Burien and greater South King County to really center the experiences of Latinx communities and uplifting their leadership, and particularly youth leadership. Roxana, it's been a pleasure to work with you. It's been an honor to really center your vision, and I'm so grateful for the time we spent together. And as well as our other kind of co-designer, Ishmael, who Roxana is going to introduce now. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kai. And welcome everyone once again. It's been such an honor to be able to work with COO and Manny and Ishmael on bringing this speaker series to life. Thank you all so much for joining us on this grand finale of year 2 of the speaker series. And now I get to introduce my colleague, Ishmael Nuñez. Ishmael Nuñez is an urban planner living in Seattle, Washington, by way of Colombia and Canada. He positions himself as an adept facilitator, collaborator, and educator with experience in supporting organizational efforts at the intersection of culture, identity, and placemaking. In his work, Ishmael seeks to create environments for people with diverse experiences to learn from one another and build relationships. He currently works as a consultant and partner at BDS Planning. Welcome, Ishmael, and I hand it off to you.
Hello, looking at the time. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Kai and Roxana, for welcoming me here, and for really, I'm very excited and honored to be able to moderate today's conversation, because storytelling, intersection of storytelling and place is so important to me, and I'm so excited to have our 3 lovely speakers share their stories with everyone here in the audience. So I will now take the next couple of moments to introduce everyone one by one, and then we'll jump into the discussion. So first of all, I'd like to welcome and introduce Gloria Ramirez Santiago. Gloria was born on April 16th in 1987 in the Rain Nation in the high mountains of Oaxaca. At birth, my grandmother was my midwife. I grew up with my mother and grandmother, from whom I learned the Sahim language, Sao, and the way of living in balance with the forest. When I was 15 years old, my mother brought me to the United States. At the beginning, I worked in the fields, and I took care of children in the community for many years. I've always been living in neighborhoods where there is a community. I love the connections with various communities, and especially the indigenous communities, because the way of life is similar. I currently have 2 children, and I like to work where I can have a connection with community and do volunteer work. Welcome, Gloria. Good to have you here. Next, I would like to introduce and welcome Michael B. Maine. Michael B. Maine creates various forms of art in and with community to increase awareness about and encourage conversations and actions around issues of social justice and equity. He describes himself as a socially engaged creative whose art practice serves as a meditation to better understand the world in which we live and the systems we've constructed. Most of Michael's projects focus on identity, power, privilege, deviance, and social movements. He often creates and chooses projects based on the ability to work with those who hold respect for the work, collaborators, communities, audiences, and anyone or anything that will ultimately be impact. Welcome, Michael. Thank you for being here. Hello. And finally, but certainly not least, I'd like to welcome Owen L. Oliver, Quinault, and Isleta Pueblo. Owen comes from the people of Lower Columbia River, Salish Sea, and Southwest Pueblos. He grew up in Ketchikan, Alaska, and Seattle, where in 2021, he graduated from the University of Washington with a degree in American Indian Studies and Political Science. Through these disciplines, he's been able to create and manage projects that range from community work, art, education, and influence on local and federal policy. His work is concentrated in Indigenous education and cultural representation, a path that he's learned from his connection to tribal canoe journeys. In Seattle, Owen has worked with the Office of Planning and Community Development, Seattle Aquarium, Burke Museum of Natural History and Culture, and the Center for American Indian and Indigenous Studies. Outside of Seattle, Owen currently serves as the secretary for the Center for Native American Youth Advisory Board, where he manages youth programming and event building for the Champions of Change program, and regularly works with the University of British Columbia. Recently, Owen published the Indigenous Walking Tour of the University of Washington, which is a reflection of Indigenous knowledge and placemaking on the University of Washington campus. In his free time, Owen enjoys trail running, writing about nature, cooking seafood for his family and friends. Welcome, Owen. Wonderful. I'm very excited and very honored, as I said, to be able to have such a really diverse and I'm sure interesting panel. And the way that we're going to do this for folks watching, we've got a series of questions that the panelists will run through. And then at the end of this, should we still have that time, we'll open up the opportunity for the audience to ask questions of their own. So with that being said, let's jump right into it. Of course, this is a series and a session about storytelling. Storytelling can be a very powerful tool for our communities to utilize. It's an important part of documenting to keep tradition alive, and being able to tell our own stories is very powerful. I'd love to hear from each of you a little bit more about the value of storytelling and why storytelling is important to you. Maybe how about we start? I'll leave it open to who might want to begin with that first question. Let's go, Owen.
Yeah. I mean, that's, I think everyone has such great answers here. But I'll open it up. When I was thinking about that land acknowledgement, and thinking about those tribes that, serve the greater Seattle area, I think about the land and what it's taught us, First people that reside in Seattle, and how we look at Mount Tahoma, let's say, for instance, Mount Rainier, and we know those stories that are connected to Tahoma, the giver of water. And we're able to connect those stories and share with our generations because it means so much to us. So I think about how the land and these landmarks that might not be seen through Western culture be so precious to us, and that we want to share it because, in the end, it's about building relationships and building reciprocity. That's what storytelling does. Is it, gives you that direct connection to the land and helps people, learn how to steward that land. So I think everything, we do is steeped in storytelling. If you're doing cultural work, that's something that you're, ingrained with, from day one, and how to show humility through storytelling and, being an active listener. And that, all really creates great storytelling because you're not just a participant, but you're engaging in that relationship that that's going to go further than just this one conversation. Millions of people have seen those mountains, and they all have their own stories to that. It's how you use those stories, to benefit other people and good, which you need to be empowered to do. So that's how I see it.
Beautiful. Thank you, Owen. Yeah, I love that piece about building relationships and reciprocity. And we'll come back to some of those things. Michael?
Sure. Thank you, Owen, for sharing. I think for me, this is such a big question. I'll try to keep it brief because no matter how much I think about this, it's hard for me to put into words. But ultimately for me, storytelling is one of the strongest, not the strongest ways for me to feel grounded in community, grounded in this world, and grounded in my existence, and helps me understand people, place, my relationship with everything that's going on. And it helps me develop just a deeper understanding of who I am and how I want to be. And it's one way that I use to continuously check how I'm bringing myself into the world, and also just my understanding of me as a person and everything. And then being able to really analyze and engage with those stories in a way that helped me feel much more connected to, again, myself, but also connected to family, friends, generations, past and future and current. And it's just one of those things that's ever present. And I think it's important because, at least for me, it is the way in which I'm able to process things, analyze things, do my own analysis, and then just develop a deeper relationship with everything that I'm trying to learn about.
Yeah, beautiful. Both you two talked about that relationship with place as well, which I'm sure is going to come up several times as well. Gloria, love to, if you can talk a little bit about the value of storytelling and why it's important to you.
Por supuesto. Empiezo por pedir permiso al espacio donde estamos, pedir permiso a estas tierras, pedir permiso por lo que estamos compartiendo, por sus conocimientos, por el conocimiento de todos y los temas que aquí estamos tocando. Tañiniento inihinani ni kachana vinaya akunina keina nunihinani. Hanasan en favor, hakuan en permiso, hakuntena ya hinaya. Haka yo hakumanya yo. Bueno, comienzo con compartir un poco de lo que acaban de preguntar. Es tan importante lo que acaban de mencionar porque muchos, nuestra pedagogía ha sido a través de la historia. Es un conocimiento que viene de atrás, viene de las comunidades, de los pueblos, de nuestros ancestros. Y es la manera en que se mantienen los valores dentro de diversas comunidades, sobre todo indígenas. Ha sido la manera en que hemos podido aprender, no solamente a conservar el conocimiento y la historia, sino también ha sido la manera como de nosotros retribuir también conocimiento en el futuro. Es bien sabido que en muchos lugares la única forma de aprender ha sido a través de forma oral en base a las historias. Así fue como yo comencé mi aprendizaje desde muy pequeña, no con estructuras académicas, sino con un sistema oral de decir, de tener la empatía con los demás, de formar círculos donde la palabra de cada uno fuese muy importante, sin importar la edad. A través de ello, seguimos conservando medicina, seguimos conservando comida y en el espacio en el que ahora estamos, porque bueno, solemos irnos a otras partes, ¿no? O cambiar de país o de lugar donde vivir. Pero los conocimientos que llevamos con las historias vienen siendo nuestras vivencias y vienen siendo también una manera de fortalecernos y de poder coexistir en otros espacios. No perdemos, las historias son como un cordón umbilical. Puedes viajar, pero siempre estarán pegados a ti. Y eso hará que la propia persona de uno pueda estar de cierta manera con sanación y también siempre poder brindar esa calidez, ese cariño, ese amor cuando se relaciona con la comunidad, ¿no? Y es tan importante, yo escucho ahora a los compañeros sobre sus conocimientos, sobre lo que hablan de la historia, y es una misma esencia, nos podemos entender, cada uno traemos cosas diferentes en la historia y mucho conocimiento. Solo falta poderlo compartir como en estos espacios que se crean. Es lo que yo les puedo compartir.
Awesome. Oh, that's amazing. Yeah, this is a great group. I'm so excited. It's interesting because we'll get into this shortly, but you know, the three of you have such, of course, different histories and lived experiences, but have talked about ways in which storytelling has helped you to sort of stay grounded in a who you are, also grounded and connected to place, and that you exist in sort of a timeline or in a history that is honoring ancestors and people before you, and also to be able to conserve and tell those stories moving forward. So we're going to get into some of those themes throughout this conversation. And something I think that's interesting is, especially for the audiences, and we've got a specific questions around this, is how this value of storytelling can find itself permeating in systems where oftentimes they've been rejected or where they've been limited in how much they get to flourish. So with that being said, given that that is a reality that happens and a struggle and tension from a cultural, indigenous, historical perspective, I wanted to hear from all of you, be willing to share about how have you been able to reclaim or conserve your stories in your own words so that you own the narrative of either your community or your people or place? Michael.
I'll try to start. Thank you for asking this question. I come from my experience with storytelling from an early age is one in which I felt like an experience of a lot of people telling me what my story was, but not really being engaged in authoring that story or hearing, learning, seeing, experiencing that story from the storytellers who I relate to in a number of ways. Specifically, things like growing up watching the news, always hearing about people that look like me, sounded like me, lived where I lived and everything. Teachers who were telling me that I was less than, and things like that. There was so much narrative that I often read and experienced that was about me, but I always felt like I was lacking that narrative from people that I could relate to in a real way. And I remember like these stories for me. I remember waking up on my 18th birthday feeling surprised because I didn't expect to make it to my 18th birthday, because all of the vast majority of the stories I had heard up until that point said, based on where I'm from, who my parents are, where they're from, situations I grew up in, the proximity to a number of substances and people and everything else, said that I won't make it to 18. And that is something that I had internalized, and took a very long time for me to consciously seek out alternative stories. And so when the question comes up about like, how do I reclaim stories or how do I own the narrative, I, as a person who processes things relatively literally, my interpretation of that question leads me to respond in a way that says something like, I don't know that I ever can own a narrative especially of a community, or my own. I feel like no matter how I share stories or craft stories and everything, there's going to be the internal story that I tell myself and understand. But the way other people will receive that, interpret that, use it, share it, is something that I don't have control over. So what I have been able to do and what I strive to do now is to be very conscious of the stories that I'm telling myself internally before they even exit in the form of words, external or artwork, photography, video, whatever, and really pay very close attention to how I am talking about myself, other people, be very conscious of the words I'm using when I'm describing people and place and me and everything, and wonder. An example might be something like, I often hear folks say there are no Black people in Seattle. And I was one day looking in the mirror and thinking about all the times that I struggled to find a barber or anybody who I could relate to for basic services and everything, and or friendships, and walking around downtown like, why am I not seeing any Black folks around here? And I was looking in the mirror one day and I said, man, there are no Black people in Seattle. And I said that while looking in the mirror in Seattle. And I was like, I just erased myself out of my own narrative, and I can't allow that to happen. And so for me, that's the kind of thing that I have to be, I feel anyway, that I have to be conscious of, because that whether if I'm not conscious of that, I'm saying it and internalizing that. And then ultimately my actions and behaviors will follow that, whether I'm knowing that I'm thinking that way or not. And and also especially being this Black person who grew up in the South and grew up in learning about slavery and everything, the number one identity that I felt I could relate to historically was the narrative of slavery, which was taught to me in the form of various books and education, et cetera, et cetera. My grandparents and great grandparents it was too painful for them to talk about slavery because like my great great grandfather owned slaves or enslaved people. And my great grandfather was an enslaved person. And so that's not very long ago. And that kind of trauma is something that my own family struggled to talk about. And it wasn't until, and so the narrative for me was basically controlled by the people in academia who wrote about slavery for the most part, until I came across a book by Julius Lester, who basically compiled a bunch of essays from people that were formerly enslaved during the transatlantic slave trade. And it was once I started reading that, the intro, I thought, wait a minute, all these years I've been hearing about slavery, and not once have I read about slavery from somebody who was enslaved. Why is that? And how do I take this and then seek out further and more literature, experiences, stories, music, video, sit down, fireplace discussions, meals, conversations in which people who are directly affected by something or experiencing something, et cetera, can have that conversation and be engaged in that. And that's when I learned about all of the beautiful things, not so much about slavery, but about the people, like the people who I come from, how they preserve their humanity and love and cooking and culture, language and everything else, and developed a much stronger sense of pride in me and who I came from, who I come from, who I hope to be a part of in the future. And yeah, and I'll leave it there. Those are the kinds of things that help me reclaim at least my own identity and humanity. Whether I control that narrative is possibly another question, but that's how, at least for me, I engage with that internally, and hope to do the same kind of thing when I share. Make sure I'm very conscious of how I share it. Okay, stopping talking right now.
No, thank you, Michael. That was beautiful. Before I go to the others, just want to sort of pull out, because there's a couple things there. One of them, I mean, you focused in on this question. I mean, part of the question is sort of this reclaim and control and ownership, and kind of seeing you removing that sort of sense of control or ownership, but unless, as it doesn't relate to how do you view yourself and how you tell those stories to yourself. And so like, that's what you are, sort of like the practice. And there's a conscientiousness and a like being conscious about how you sort of then retell either your own story or of people. But I liked how you basically were like, don't really see this aspect of control in the stories of my people and community. And then, yeah, that full circle of not seeing those that you relate to, and then also acknowledging that the stories and histories of the people you relate to may not be ready or accessible for you at any given moment, because people are working through their own traumas and their own. So I thought that was a really interesting, really beautiful nuance. How about let's have Gloria. Gloria, how have you been able to reclaim your stories in your own words and own, if you would like to choose the narrative of your community, people, or place?
Sí, la manera en que yo he podido ha sido tener presente a mis antecedentes culturales para poder desarrollar mejor mi sentido de empatía. Es una parte difícil porque se tiene que tener o es donde vuelve a nacer mucho la parte de qué traumas has tenido, ¿no? qué dificultades has presentado o cuándo ha sido difícil. Y entonces resurge ese temor de pronto de generar eso mismo cuando hablas de que tienes que recabar tu historia. Muchas veces se omite, pero es algo que se tiene que trabajar, interiorizar, porque muchas de esas cosas vinieron de afuera y se quedan muy presentes. Eso es una parte que enferma al momento de tú crear tu propia historia, pero es una parte de medicina para cuando tienes que recabar historia de alguien más, porque tienes mucho cuidado de qué preguntas, de cómo preguntas, de a quién le preguntas. Yo no podría ir a una comunidad a recabar historia, a una comunidad que no hablemos la misma lengua, que no seamos de la misma cultura, por respeto. Yo pudiera recabar historias con personas de mi comunidad, de mi pueblo, porque tenemos muchos aspectos culturales que nos unen. Y una cosa que puedo compartir al momento de ir al espacio, al hogar de alguien más de mi pueblo, a recabar una historia o a que me compartan sus vivencias, que es así como le llamamos, es llegar, saludarles, ir con disponibilidad de tiempo, llevar una canastita de ofrenda, frutas, panes, siempre preguntar cómo están y pedir permiso, ¿no? Explicarles bien por qué razón yo quiero su historia, o en qué va a ayudar eso, dónde va a quedar eso. Y ellos deciden si deciden compartir o no, pero cuando yo estoy haciendo eso, yo estoy pensando en mí. ¿Qué me gustaría? ¿Cómo me gustaría que cuando una situación así, que me pregunten a mí, cómo yo quiero que sean esas preguntas? ¿Cómo, o de qué manera yo llevar una conversación donde pueda ser sano, donde no termine ofendido, lastimado, y que sea un espacio en el que pueda sentirme con la libertad de expresar? Trato de siempre interiorizar, es como si yo me estuviera preguntando a mí mismo lo que yo voy a preguntarle a los demás.
I'm excited to see how that, again, the three of you are like right in this like really beautiful like arrangement, because things that I thought, Gloria, you shared, you also shared kind of like Michael was talking about, of the like internalizing and the stories of how you sort of understand yourselves. And you said similarly around the challenges or traumas and how that resurfaces in that storytelling. And so in thinking about others and approaching in one another and being in community to share lived experiences, it was you also hint at that piece around sort of permission and again, sort of this relationship with this idea of ownership and understanding that what someone is giving up is very important. And so how are you asking to receive that and vice versa? So I'm curious, Owen, as well, just in the line of the question and what you've heard so far, I'm sure you're going to fit really well in there as well.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, first off, I feel, humbled to be here. I'm quite young, so I'm still gathering my own stories, but I often, see myself relating through, the stories of my ancestors and then the stories I want to tell, the future generations that come. And when we think about reclaiming stories, especially from, indigenous culture in North America, and the traumas of colonization and assimilation, that comes still with a lot of risk to do. A lot of our stories have been stolen and tokenized because that identity wants to be taken and co-opted. We see Seattle named after Chief Seattle, But in our Coast Salish ways, we don't name places after people. You know, that's a very taboo thing because you want to let them go. You want them to go into that spirit world. So there's that disconnect right there with how we see ourselves in Seattle. And, you know, with the, you know, a good story to tell is, you know, playing Indian, you know, cowboys and Indians, everybody knows that, you know, but, you know, the cowboys always win, you know, the Indians never win. And that, you know, being perpetrated by the media, you know, all the ways back, you know, 60, 70 years ago, and then how it's shown in the classrooms, you know, Thanksgiving, you know, playing Indians, you know, that's, you know, a hard thing to do as a kid to, you know, grapple with that. So at an early age, it was that idea of, you know, I'm being told one thing from my family, but then I go to school and see a different thing. And, you know, Michael was hitting on that too, is that where do you see yourself in that picture? And where do you want to move forward with that, with, you know, holding yourself in community and being accountable? So when we reclaim these stories, you know, we have to be really intentional, you know, as Gloria was saying, like to move them forward in an appropriate way that does more than just telling them, but pushing, you know, pushing community to, you know, be more accepting and to hold each other and to, you know, want to innovate together. And, you know, that's just so important to let people know of the traumas that have happened, but we want to know the successes that have happened too. You know, that arcing line of storytelling, you know, get the reader, but also push forward what's happening now. So there's many elements in Seattle that, you know, show that. And, you know, people have thought forever that totem poles were a crucial part of Seattle's landscape. But totem poles are from more Vancouver Island and Southeast Alaska. But we've been ingrained with this idea that these totem poles are from here. No, I mean, that's the enemy's art and, you know, a way. And that's what people have said. But, you know, it's how do we, you know, bring these stories together and again to, you know, push them forward, you know. We're all Indigenous people are so close, you know, and we have that shared experience among other, you know, POC groups. But it's a lot of that fighting of tokenization that still happens today, that it's more than just reclaiming, but fixing those stories as well.
Yeah, it's interesting because the three of you, and I'm really like fixing on this because I'm seeing it coming up in these three, but you know, the three of you have talked about for yourself from a cultural perspective, that sense of like ownership not being as like inherently tied to sort of the storytelling. But in all of these different cases, the introduction of like systems, whether we'll talk about this in a second, but like whether it's capitalism, other forms of system government, which operates on a necessity of power and control, has introduced that into the concept of storytelling. So you said, Owen, our stories have been stolen from us and have been co-opted, have been tokenized. And so it's interesting to see, and maybe folks on the call as well are seeing that, where you know you're from a really foundational piece, these sort of systems or isms are not present in the sort of everyday life and the way folks live their lives and come to understand place and community. But we've had this introduction, so now such a question like how do we reclaim becomes relevant of a question to ask because the introduction of power has been brought in. So I'm just seeing all of that. The other thing something you said, Owen, that made me think of, I remember several years ago, this was a very simple framing that someone shared with me, but often, for example, the term like underrepresented, under-resourced, et cetera. She also used the term miss. So she said, communities have been underrepresented or misrepresented. And I've really latched onto that for a long time as well, where it's like, Michael, you're saying our story is being told to me, but it's a misrepresentation. So I'm interested to get back to that point. This speaker series has, over the course of this year and this speaker series, we've tried to get to a place where other folks can sort of participate and understand how they participate either for themselves or in community as it relates to, in their communities as it relates to what we're talking about here. So I wanted to ask about how can, from your perspective, how can others learn to tell their stories? We think about components, how to capture knowledge, how to search for stories, how to share. So how can others learn to tell their stories? Let's have Gloria.
Gloria, yeah.
Gracias. Una de las muchas maneras que pueden o que se puede aprender para recolectar o para las historias es que las personas que de pronto tienen un conocimiento, es decir, que han ido a las escuelas y que han estudiado y que saben tecnología y todas estas cosas, es buscar acompañarnos a quienes no tenemos esas enseñanzas. Podemos compartir conocimiento. Nosotros podemos tomarles de la mano y decirles, puedes venir a mi comunidad para aprender, pero no con una explotación y tampoco con una victimización, porque no somos ni lo uno ni lo otro debe ser. Debe ser un acompañamiento. Cuando quieran conocer de nuestras historias, de nuestras comunidades, busquen a las personas adecuadas, busquen a las personas de esas comunidades, háganlo en el lenguaje de esas personas. Sucede que si yo digo ahora un chiste en español y me lo traducen a inglés, eso no va a sonar gracioso, se pierde y de pronto tal vez solo se quede en el traductor, que sí me entendió en el lenguaje original y luego lo tradujo y le sonó gracioso, pero ya traducido no siempre suena gracioso. Entonces, hay una reflexión de una abuela. No se sabe de dónde, si del norte, del sur, de dónde haya venido la historia, que cuando una telaraña se rompe, la única que puede repararlo es una araña. Entonces eso nos deja un entendimiento bien grande de que no podemos introducirnos tan fácilmente a querer llevar nuestra idea o nuestro conocimiento sin compartirlo. A mí me ha tocado vivir aquí y se ve mucho la imponencia. Y cuando eso sucede es muy triste, porque deberían de ser, al momento de querer ir a nuestras comunidades, deberían de permitir que quienes hagan la distribución de alimentos, quienes hablen de cultivos, quienes hablen de tierra, de cuidado del medio ambiente, sean las propias comunidades, a las comunidades que han estado viviendo, que han estado luchando por esos espacios, que tienen conocimiento, que viven con la energía de esos lugares y que se vive con la energía de la comunidad. Si yo quiero ir a un barrio, yo debo de conocer a alguien ahí, pero yo no le voy a ir a decir, llévame a tu barrio porque necesito historias de tu gente. No, me gustaría a través de ti conocer a tu comunidad, saber quiénes son, qué hacen, cómo son, desde los jóvenes hasta las personas mayores. Y lo que les decía hace un momento, enseñarnos también a nosotros, a compartirnos, a decirnos, mira, yo sé tecnología, yo te ayudo, vamos a recabar historias en tu comunidad, yo te ayudo a enseñarte cómo, no sé, cómo ponerlo en este aparato, en este equipo, pero tú eres la persona quien me está acompañando y quien me está apoyando para hacer esto. No se puede introducir a una comunidad o a una cultura sin un permiso, sin tener conexión, sin tener la vivencia, porque para llegar ahí tienes que tener empatía, tienes que tener amor por esas personas, por ese lugar a donde vas. No se puede llegar así, siendo simple. Hola, ¿cómo estás? Vine a esto. Eso es algo que produce un vacío internamente. Entonces, siempre buscar la manera de crear los espacios adecuados, que quien recabe tu historia sea tu gente, que quien te distribuya alimentos sea la persona que entiende tu cultura, que entiende tu lengua. Todos deberíamos de tener esos espacios adecuados. Y sucede mucho con la educación. Yo tengo unos conflictos muy grandes porque mi sistema o mi manera en la que yo vine aprendiendo es diferente a la que he llegado acá. Y ha sido una manera opresiva de decir, no puedes hacer esto, no puedes hacer aquello. El no me asusta tanto que hay cosas en las que ya no prefiero no preguntar o no hacer por el no lo hagas. Y también estoy como, realmente, ¿qué es lo que yo quiero? Porque mis ideas chocan mucho con los estudios, ¿no? Creo que tengo que aprender a descolonizarme en lugar de seguir aprendiendo el sistema de estudios, que al menos para mí culturalmente no es adecuado. Falta muchísimo para que puedan entendernos, que somos diversas comunidades, que tenemos diversas maneras de aprender, diferentes culturas, y que deberían de haber espacio para cada uno de nosotros. Y cada uno de las personas podemos hacer cambios para crear espacios más sanos y de mayor conectividad, con una energía o con una esencia única y auténtica, para que podamos tener una convivencia donde donde reconozcamos el espacio adecuado para cada uno.
Yeah, beautiful, Gloria. This is a question that was similar to some of the response you shared earlier. This, how can others learn to tell stories? And really hearing you talk about like your intent, or one person's intent to learn about another community's or people's stories, should be because it's relational. I'm hearing you say, like, get as close as you can for the purposes of actually building that relationship, so that you can, come with us, create together, as close as in relevant languages, and then to sort of understand that you're trying to leave that situation, you're trying to leave those circumstances in a way where folks are healthy, and that's a healthy relationship. So and you talked about some of those pieces around permission, respect, and empathy that I think are really important. So thank you, Gloria. Owen, how about you? How can, from your perspective, what do you think about how others can learn to tell this?
Yeah, I think, that's a question that's always asked. And, Gloria did a beautiful job of, it takes time, saying, it takes time to build these relationships, and acknowledge that these relationships take time. When you're entering into these spaces, whether that's volunteering, whether that's going into panels, whether that's educating yourself, no, it's not an instant gratification. It's not instantly, you're being held, in these spaces, because that's not how easy it was for us. That wasn't, we were taught to listen, again, be active participants. And, there's so many stories that we don't know, that we may never be taught those stories because we're not ready for that. I often say that a lot of people today don't like mystery. They don't like the unknown because they want it now. They want to know what it is. And I just tell them, like, you don't get to know that right now. Sorry. Like, you have to, when the time is right, or when it involves you, like, you get to know, and I think that's, something, that I was taught, was that, you put that time in and you put those spaces in, and it will come to you, like, whether through these different channels, like, you'll learn. one of the spaces that I really began to understand stories of my peers and others was in college. As an urban native myself, I, could go to spaces around the city. Daybreak Star was the biggest one back then, to, gather together. But in college at the University of Washington, it was just other Native students in a club where we could just talk to each other, where we could, be young kids, in this big city and just figuring it out together. It's that shared experience. So when people ask me, how do you get into those spaces? It's, the question isn't how you get into those spaces, but it's how you align yourself with those values. It's not those interests of, oh, I want to study Indigenous people, or I want to study, the Black experience. It's, I value, the strides these people have taken, and I want to, center them, and I want to help them. And I think that's, so important. And, that follows a lot of, advice that others would give you is, if you want to learn, Indigenous science or read Indigenous literature, you learn it from Indigenous people. So that's that umbrella. Then you can go deeper, learn it from the region, let's say the Pacific Northwest. Well, you're in Seattle, find Indigenous Coast Salish, authors, Suquamish, Duwamish, Tulalip, Muckleshoot, find those people because they exist. You just got to do that research to really connect yourself to that place, exactly where you're researching. You can't just throw that umbrella out, and just because you're learning about, Indigenous people, way over there, it's not going to directly relate to exactly how you're living through that city. So that's a little bit about it, but, really try to localize yourself. So when we say land acknowledgements, if you don't know those tribes that are being said, look it up. If you're curious, research that, don't take it for granted. So really localize yourself in that knowledge, and, how you want to disseminate that.
Yeah. Thank you, Owen. I like how, so it's funny you said some of these things, because I've been thinking about some of them myself. This like pushing back, it's another one of those sort of like introduction. You talk about power, you're talking about urgency, this instant gratification, this like entitlement to access, and you're saying it can come if you are aligning yourselves in those values and in that sort of participation in that community. It'll come, and it's not, you've reframed from like, I'm seeking out to, to some end, but rather I'm trying to participate and put myself in those. I was thinking about how, and sort of, suppose folks in the audience as well, like for example, we talk about like community engagement and work across a lot of different spheres, and like you can observe when people are, let's call it input, let's call it stories for the case of here, but it exists as like a data point, like over here, and like when they'd like to, they can access that, as opposed to just aligning themselves and bringing that understanding of what they're into closer to like who they are. Then it becomes not a data point, but it becomes part of your understanding as well. And it'd probably change the way that you would do a lot of the work. So yeah, a lot of that is I'm hearing from you, Owen, as well, sort of this like instant gratification and that alignment. Michael, how do you think about how others can share and learn to tell their stories?
Oh, much of what I would say to that has already been said very eloquently by both Gloria and Owen, and also Juan in the chat. The word that comes up to me initially is entitlement, and to understand that first and foremost, that nobody is entitled to your story, and that whatever that story is, and I think that there's never just a singular story for any group of people or any individual either, and that in storytelling, it's important to have agency over what the story is, what the narrative is, how to share it, etc. And and I say those words as singular, like in the singular, but I think that any of those really plural applies. So narratives, stories, and everything, because we are not just one thing. We're not a monolithic whatever. I think another thing is, for me, I really like to analyze when we say storytelling, what are we talking about? And I think oftentimes in public discourse around stuff like storytelling, there's a very academic tone and approach to that. And we start talking about archetypes and narrative structure and what goes into a story and how do we control a story. And in my work, I get asked all the time, Michael, how do we control the narrative, and how do we control this? And I'm like, I don't know that we need to control the narrative. For me, storytelling for me personally, and I can only speak for myself, storytelling is about inviting people into community and into conversation. And it's not about, I never want to tell you what to think. I want to share something that might help you think differently or open up other ways of thinking and things like that. So I think it's really important for me. It's not just literature. It's not just music. It's not just photography or video production or anything. It's everything. It's how we, like, this is different from this, and is different from that. Like it's in the way we prepare food, the way we share food, cook food, what foods. Like there's so much information and history and culture in why is this considered soul food? Why is soul food applied to a specific region or a specific group of people, and not like other people might have souls and whatnot? Like, why is that soul food? It's how we walk, how we dress, there's so much storytelling in everything we do, everything around us, how we construct things, how we share things, and all of that. And I think it's very important to keep that in mind, that there is not a singular best way or a singular valid way of sharing stories. Some people are nonverbal, and they're just as important storytellers as anybody else who exists in this world. So I'll say that to first say, sometimes maybe you don't want to share your story, and that's cool. And if you do want to share your story or stories, then I think there are a lot of ways to go about that. Again, for me, a lot of that starts internally, and paying attention to what stories I'm telling myself. And a lot of times that's what the stories I'm talking about to myself, but it's also things like, am I finding myself judging somebody before I have any reason to judge that person? If there's ever any reason to judge that person, like, what kinds of assumptions am I making? What have I internalized? What am I what am I also doing to promote, perpetuate, dispel myths, other stories, narratives about people and place and things that already exist in the world? And so now I'll try to answer your question more directly. Let me see here. I got some notes. I've been writing down some notes. Let's see, learn. Oh yeah, pay attention to the stories of other people. When people ask things like, yo, Michael, you're connected to Black folks and queer folks and the artist community, et cetera, how do we get Black people to come to our show? And the first question I ask is, well, when was the last time you bought a ticket and went to a public show of the people that you say you're interested in? And this sentiment has already been mentioned by both Gloria and Owen. But I'm like, why? Like, why? Are you actually interested? Or are you looking to increase sales? If you're looking to increase sales, ask that question. If you are looking to really develop relationships with people, then in many cases, people are pretty aware of how to build relationships with people, and it's showing up, it's waiting for invitations, it's taking a genuine interest, and not in that exotification manner, taking a real interest. Like, I think if most of the people who ask me how to get people to go to their shows, go to the shows of the people they're interested in, then that interest will develop over time. Because then when they're experiencing those stories, they will learn things, laugh, cry, experience things, and go, wow, you know what? This is cool, or this is not cool. I don't like it. And that's okay too. You don't have to like everything, but you're still building, relationship, you're building more knowledge and everything, and just a deeper understanding of different types of storytelling. knowing that stories come from everywhere and everybody, and practicing with oneself. So again, starting with, for me, is what words am I using? How am I sharing my own stories? And then practicing. So a lot of what I do is try to take myself out of my headspace and put things into practice. And we don't have to necessarily start with a museum piece or anything. That could start with writing a letter to yourself, writing a letter to a friend, a family member. It can be sending an email to somebody and going into a little bit more detail, or thinking critically about the words that I am putting on the screen or on the paper. It's also understanding to, for me, it's about consuming stories, paying attention to stories, engaging with those stories, not just reading a book for the sake of saying I read 52 books this year. It's about reading that book and maybe stopping every few pages or paragraphs and going, why is this the selection that was put here? This author, this musician, this composer, this chef arranged this in a specific way on purpose. What's the context here? Where is this coming from? Why did they choose that? And then I think building that kind of literacy over time and true genuine interest and engagement will help people be able to share stories naturally. It's listening when people are talking. Like, if I have several friends who are constantly complaining about things and constantly celebrating things, and I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, so why are we celebrating this thing? Or why? This is a complaint I hear over and over and over. Next time I'm in a room with somebody who is perpetuating the subject of this complaint, maybe I can understand where they're coming from, say something, be an advocate, or whatever. So, and then, of course, there's technology. There's how to share it. There's dissemination. There's social media. It's also, for me, a lot of it is just thinking, I don't know everything. I can't know everything. If I want to share a story, then I consume stories and I engage with people. And when I say engage with people, it's things like walks around the park, hopping on the phone, engaging in like writing letters with people, paying attention, stopping speaking from time to time, and just letting things happen, sitting around fireplaces, sharing meals with folks, and then applying some of that academic stuff that I've picked up over the years and meshing those together so that it's real, it's genuine, and it's something I'm passionate about. And again, I'll stop talking. I felt like I was going on a ramble.
You're good, and it's great actually, because the last thing you just said is like actually like almost a full complete circle to one of the first things that Gloria said. Because Gloria talked about like sharing in our differences, or sharing what each other has to offer, and we just sort of went through this whole circle where you find all of that had to happen before Michael could then say, oh, I have these skills with this technology or this production with photography that then together we can create and tell a story. All of that sort of relationship building, all of that patience, all of that like reciprocity, all of that understanding, it was almost just like emblematic in the way that just unfolded. The answer to this question, nobody said, let me tell you how to like write a great article, and let me tell you how to. You touched on it very briefly, each of you, but it's like that's a minor component of how others can learn to tell the stories. And much major component is sort of that relational piece, that alignment. You said something as well that Owen talked about with, being an active listener and active participant as well. So I think that's really important, because I'm very honored to be able to like be in this space and hear all of you talk about this, because that might have been something that I would have assumed would have taken up more space in the answer to that question, but I'm so glad that it didn't, because it was a lot more important to talk about how you get to that place where you can then participate in that storytelling. So this is great. We've got one more question for the panelists and all of these things have been tying together, and then we'll use the remaining time we've got until 1:30, depending on how much space we've got left before we close, to get any questions from the audience. So we'll wrap up with this question and then we'll go there. So everything that we've been talking about has been really attuned to the really personal, internalized community, cultural, etc., around relationship building and the sharing of stories and lived experiences. And we've also seen the places and moments throughout this conversation where the introduction of a system, an oppressive system, has complicated that. And so the question is, how is that working together? How is that working together today? How should it work in the future? So how do you bring ancestral or indigenous or cultural storytelling in these systems of capitalism, nonprofit sector, government, fundraising, private business, entrepreneurship, et cetera? How do you bring everything we've talked about into those systems? Or maybe you don't.
I think I'm trying to rotate who goes first, so we're not always putting somebody on the spot.
Go, just go.
Yeah. I think storytelling is one of the oldest institutions on the planet. And when we talk about institutions being whatever, government, capitalism, nonprofit, et cetera, all of that, to me anyway, came after storytelling originated. And so I think it's more, for me, it's more of thinking about how to incorporate some of those into storytelling and not so much the other way around. I've often, like, how many times have folks been in like board meetings or community meetings where the conversation ends up around fundraising, or how do we keep the lights on, or how do we reach a certain group of people, et cetera. And oftentimes losing or forgetting or not centering the purpose of that gathering in the first place. Like, why was this business created? Why was this nonprofit created? Why are we doing this? And who are we trying to serve? Why are we the people trying to serve these people? How are we in community with them? Why is it us and them? Why is it not us? Why is it not we? Why, these kinds of things. And so for me, like, it's understanding what structures are organic and natural and what structures are not, and how have we sometimes superseded those organic structures of humanity with the artificial stuff, and kind of, I don't want to say lose sight, but like how we decentered a lot of that heart and soul and replaced it with some of those other things. An example, and I hear this often, is people talk about financial statements being a moral document, and I think that is true. Like, if I look at a document or a set of financial statements, I'm not only looking at or paying attention to the profit and loss or the income statements or the budget versus actuals. I'm looking at these numbers and analyzing them and going, okay, where are we placing our value? How can we invest in this thing to achieve this other goal? Why are we charging for this thing for these people when this could be provided for free, or whatever that is? So I'm always trying to understand, what is it within this? Like, how do we take this data and take this number or whatever that data is and find the story there and find the narrative there? And usually there are multiple stories. There's oftentimes competing interests and competing needs, and sometimes there are collaborative needs and everything. But like, really taking those and understanding, what are we actually paying attention to here, and then we really weave that into the stories and understand what we're doing. I think at that point it becomes relatively natural to bring those stories in, and a lot of that is indigenous wisdom and the cultural backgrounds and various cultural backgrounds, because a lot of this stuff is not natural. And so for us, it's not the way we talk about. Historically, if something happened in a community, in various communities around the world, it's like, this is a problem. Historically speaking, generations ago, it was not, okay, let's break open Excel and figure out how many people died for us to come to the solution. It was, this is a problem. Let's get together. Let's work on this thing. Let's feed this person today, right now, and let's figure out a system or a solution so that this doesn't happen in the future. And I'll stop again. But yeah.
Yeah. No, thank you, Michael. Yeah. I mean, yeah, I know Roxana has said things like that a lot to me as well. It's like, these these things are not natural. This is not sort of an organic development. And so that's where a lot of that tension is and how you can bring that in, but understanding the ways in which these systems can start to bring in that heart work or that like empathetic work that's actually really needed to be able to start to align with what's organic and natural and make that connection. How about Owen?
Yeah, something I wanted to add in other spots, but I think this is perfect, is, these stories, again, have been integral parts in these institutions, but let's, remind ourselves too that tribes, especially in North America, federally recognized tribes are sovereign nations. So they, push up those stories to a level that's different than organizations or communities, that they are based in the supreme law of the land of those treaties, and that they have retained their rights through colonization to preserve those stories. They didn't gain those rights, but they have held on to them. They have fought for those, as the original peoples of these lands, and how that tribe wants to orientate themselves, and determine what's best for their members, that's up to them. But those stories have been, held together, since time immemorial, since that written time, we're oral people, so they've been shared down that way. So when people want to get into Indigenous stories too, you also have to understand, what is a sovereign nation and what is a tribe, because there's more power there than, just another community. There's legal protections and legal rights that are so important and often get neglected. When we talk about treaty rights in Washington, let's talk about the Bolt decision in 1974 that allowed non-native fishermen and native fishermen to split 50-50. Before that, native fishermen were only getting 5% of the fish. And there's stories connected to that. There's stories that, have allowed native people to progress through, those legal systems, but also have been detrimental in so many ways. So just wanted to let everyone know that. And, with nonprofit work, with organizational work, that's kind of the work I do, is to bring those stories and cultural relevancy into those spaces, in an appropriate way that follows those protocols. Again, we're not telling you everything, we're not telling you how to extract it in the future. We are, I'm guiding you to, make your own assumptions and make your own judgments that advance those systems to, connect, those members to the land, and to that context of those lands. Often it's just that land acknowledgement, but we need to go further. So one activity I bring to a lot of, organizations is having their members and, board write, a past, present, and future right about Indigenous people. So you spend 10 minutes just writing about the past. What have you experienced with Indigenous people in the past? Write 10 minutes about that. Anything that has come up. Maybe you had a friend in kindergarten, and he was Native, like think about that, any experiences. And then we talk about the present, write 10 minutes just about the present. What is going on right now, and that's a little harder, directly within the months, what's going on now, 10 minutes. And then, they've started to reflect on this, and then it's a 10-minute write in the future. So write everything you want to do to maybe help Indigenous people accomplish these things. Where do you want to see yourself? And it seems the future one, they're just writing for that full 10 minutes, but that past one's a little harder for them. So, it's those activities that, help guide people's learning into, being storytellers themselves, but, culturally responsive ones too. And just creating a more aware, listener and, So
Yeah.
that's all over the place, but yeah.
No, you're good. Thank you. I mean, that's consistent with talking about sort of all of this existing in a timeline, and that all of those things are connected. And so it's important to understand and connect that history, that present, and the future as well, which a lot of times might overlook. And yeah, and it's a really important thing to have remind people or introduce people when you're talking at the beginning of that around sovereignty, and that those are very, very different interactions when we're thinking about particularly Indigenous people and federally recognized tribes. Thank you, Owen. Okay, Gloria, to close us out, how do you bring ancestral Indigenous cultural storytelling into the systems that we've been talking about today?
Sí, híjoles, como decimos en español, ¿no? Es una de las partes más fuertes, porque la mayor opresión y el mayor racismo ha venido de los propios sistemas gubernamentales. Aquí nosotros somos números, no historias. Cuando hablamos de la base de datos del gobierno, de la índole que sea, no son nuestras historias las que salen, son los números, y eso es triste. Vivimos en un sistema donde creo que todos de cierta manera somos víctimas, donde esos sistemas donde te dicen qué hacer, cómo moverte, se habla de la libertad de expresión, pero en realidad no existe, porque tú tienes que, o uno tiene que adaptarse, que si vas a la escuela, solo tienes un tiempo límite para hablar y no compartes tu conocimiento. Tienes que repetir lo que dicen los libros, repetir lo que te ponen en el pizarrón. La colonización, el capitalismo, nos han educado, nos han estado educando para ser individualistas, para pensar en que yo estoy bien, en que yo vivo cómodamente, no me importa cómo vive el otro, no sé qué le falta. A nuestros jóvenes, cuando venimos de las comunidades indígenas y llegamos en un espacio donde el capitalismo es muy fuerte, empieza a haber un choque bien fuerte, y lo estoy hablando desde mi propia vivencia e historia. Sucede que con nosotros, en nuestras comunidades, no importa el color de ropa que te pongas, no importa la marca, lo importante es que pueda cubrirte. Cuando llegas a un espacio donde no es así, empieza a haber un choque. ¿Por qué? Porque tus hijos dicen, yo quiero tener unos buenos zapatos con una marca, yo quiero tener una ropa bien combinada, esta marca es importante. Y entonces tú empiezas, ¿qué pasó aquí? Yo me pongo la ropa sin importar si los colores combinan o no. Aprendí a agradecer lo que yo tenía a la mano y con lo que yo tenía. ¿Qué pasaba? Que internamente primero cuidaba mi persona y mi espíritu, el sentirme bien. No que me viera bien, sino que yo me sintiera bien. Y aquí esa perspectiva cambia. Cuando hablamos del gobierno y de sus sistemas, nos hablan mucho de la libertad de expresión. Sin embargo, te dan formularios, firme aquí, llene acá, y va a ser esto, y va a ser como yo lo diga y cuando yo diga. Entonces yo me quedo, ¿de qué estamos hablando? Esto no es libertad, y se ha perdido tanto que yo pienso que las propias personas, cuando están en un espacio trabajando en oficinas para el gobierno, pueden ayudarnos a hacer cambios. ¿Cómo pueden ayudarse a hacer esos cambios? Muchas veces es decir, a ver, vamos a hacer un trabajo para tal comunidad, pero hay que formular las preguntas y el formulario desde la propia comunidad, que lo haga alguien o varias personas de esas propias comunidades. ¿Cuáles serían las preguntas adecuadas? ¿Cuáles son las preguntas o qué palabras se utilizan en sus comunidades que sean entendibles? Eso sería tener o crear, ¿no?, un espacio equitativo. Sí, no porque yo tenga el poder y no porque yo estoy en el gobierno, yo te voy a decir lo que tú me vas a contestar. No, Yo te voy a ayudar para que tú formules con tu comunidad una serie de preguntas, un formulario, cómo, y que dejemos de ser números, que podamos ser historias realmente, que podamos ser incluidos con nuestras propias voces. Esas son algunas de las maneras. Y pues bueno, ese es un tema tan extenso que reviviría muchas cosas. Yo, y es lo que les voy a compartir ya por último, les comparto un poco por qué de pronto hay una gran diferencia. El lugar de donde yo nací y crecí, la autoridad se nombra en base a votación por la comunidad. Cada año la comunidad elige a quién debe representarnos como autoridad. No importa su género, pero es por votación de comunidad. Y yo aquí no entiendo cómo funciona el sistema. En algún momento en el pasado, yo me hice la idea, va a haber un día, se van a poner los candidatos y podemos ir y podemos levantar la mano y votar. Y cuando no sucedía, yo, o sea, ¿cómo eligen? ¿Cómo gobiernan? ¿Cómo se hace que no se hace en comunidad? Solíamos limpiar las calles allá, todos. La calle es en sí muy, muy pequeños, terracería. Salíamos con los niños pequeños y los adultos y recolectábamos la basura y la separábamos. Entonces, estando acá, yo quería hacer lo mismo. Yo decía, ¿cuándo van a salir? ¿Cuándo van a convocar al barrio, ¿no? Por decir, para que juntemos basura. Y empezaba a darme cuenta que eso no existe. Empecé a tener choques con las facturas de agua y de basura. Y yo decía, pero si de donde yo vengo, nadie es dueño del agua. El agua no tiene dueño. El agua no importa si está en tu propiedad, un pozo, es de todos. Todos lo pueden consumir. Entonces sí he tenido, en base a mi historia, muchos choques que he llegado a encontrar y que no los he entendido. Y entre ellos también está el trabajo que no quisiera trabajar tanto porque quisiera tener más tiempo para la comunidad, para mí, pero el sistema en el que vivimos nos obliga, está detrás de nosotros. Si no trabajas suficiente, no vas a tener para pagar tus facturas. Eso es una forma de opresión, es una forma de esclavizarte, es una forma de perseguirte a que lo tengas que hacer. No es que no es que tengas opción. Y bueno, regresando a lo de la basura y lo del agua, no tendríamos por qué pagar. Nosotros estamos acostumbrados a no tener fronteras. Eso ha llegado con la colonización, con el capitalismo, que no es solidario en lo absoluto y nos está enseñando una manera de lastimarnos, porque ya no tenemos derecho a la tierra. No tienes aquí derecho a tener un espacio para cultivar. No tienes derecho a un lugar de nacimiento de agua para tú ir a traerlo con libertad, porque incluso te puedes meter en problemas si lo haces. Entonces, pues es lo que les puedo compartir.
Thank you so much, Gloria. Yeah, wow. Some of the things that I got from there as well, you and some of these lines that are connected. You also talked about that internalization, but yeah, really that a lot of these values have been assigned, and that it is inevitable that some of those clashes will happen. But you pointed out all the same reasons, kind of like Michael was saying. These things are all inorganic, and so getting to the root of some of to participate in really building relationships and to participate in really coming to understand each other and to work together requires that sort of return back to what is sort of that natural and organic. And we've heard that all throughout today's conversation. So I just want to thank the three of you, Gloria, Owen, Michael. So great to be in space with you and to have you all come on here and share stories. Yeah, I've learned a lot, and I feel very honored as well. I don't see any questions in the chat or in the Q&A, and we're coming close to time here. So I'm going to pass it back over to Roxana to close this out. But thank you all for your time.
Thank you so much, Ishmael, to Michael, Gloria, Owen. So much gratitude to you three for the medicine that you all just shared with us. As we are transitioning seasons, and at least we hope that we're transitioning seasons, I think this is a really great kind of conversation to move us into this period of reflection that so many of us enter as fall starts to show up in the Pacific Northwest. I know that I've taken a lot of gems. I know I've taken a lot of notes and a lot of moments of just kind of thinking through my own journey and my own kind of things that I need to work through in this next season in my life. And so that was incredibly powerful. I'm always excited for these, but I knew that the storytelling one was the one that we needed to close off with because of the time of year and also because of what we wanted to do with this particular speaker series with the theme of grounded and just making sure we all feel grounded, right? There's so much uncertainty. There's so much tension. There's so much conflict that we're existing in and so much transition really in our communities and in the world in general. That this just makes me feel really connected in a way that I haven't felt connected before. So again, Michael, Owen, and Gloria, thank you so much for your gifts today, for your medicine. Thank you to everyone who is here, who was able to partake and bear witness to such an incredible panel of people. And Ishmael, you did such an amazing job moderating, so I just want to give you a shout out as well. Again, please take a survey and tell us how we did. I think we'll close out at 1:30, like we said. Once again, thank you to Communities of Opportunity for the vision behind the speaker series and for trusting our team to have this come to life. And take care, everybody. Stay fly and get some rest. Thank you so much.
Yeah.